Well, good morning everybody from my side. Unfortunately I cannot see you, but I pretend to. It's kind of dark in the room. It's really a pleasure to be back here again, and I'd like to thank you very much for inviting me to Ljubljana. It's really great to meet some of the old colleagues here that I've known for quite a while, to meet you again. And it's also fantastic to meet new colleagues and see their fascinating work. The provocating title of this whole seminar has something to do with Beyond Green, and that's why I've chosen to give you a bit of a theoretical background on the projects we're going to see in the next hours, as a matter of fact. It's going to be really, I'm very curious to see your work, especially those of the practitioners. I'm basically a little bit more concentrating on the research and the teaching part of landscape architecture. And my job is, that's what I was told, to give you like an introduction to some general theoretical thoughts on landscape architecture and the importance of landscape architecture, especially in the urban context. That's why I'm talking about urban landscape systems and the subtitle More Than Green Infrastructure. Well, just to give you a bit of an introduction, the situation, the problem we're facing today is pretty clear actually, right? More than ever before, we are confronted with the task to plan and to transform cultural complex systems, cultural complex landscapes. And for me, by the way, and that's sometimes a bit of provocation for our friends from architecture, the city is just a special manifestation of landscape. For me personally, the city is just a special type of landscape. Why? Because I'm following the definition by J.B. Jackson, who once pointed out that a landscape is not a natural feature of the environment, but he says it's a synthetic space, a man-made system of spaces superimposed on the face of the land, functioning and evolving not according to natural laws, but to serve a community. So J.B. Jackson formulated this, as you can see, in 1984, And if you think about that landscape is a man-made system of spaces, I'm asking, well, what's a city? It is a man-made system of spaces, so a city is, according to this definition, a landscape. And that has broad implications on what we do in landscape architecture in the future. To serve a community. We're now living in the era of the Anthropocene, and there is no untouched landscape on this planet anymore. We're all well aware of that fact, and that's why I think a city can easily be understood as a special type of landscape, and that means, and now it gets a bit, from my point of view, especially interesting, that means that exactly the same set of rules that we think are applying to landscape will apply to a city as well. We have a couple of challenges that we have to meet. Basically speaking, and that's also not pretty new, but I think we have to recover and recollect this all the time. We have rapid urban densification. We're faced with transformation challenges. We have severe global climate changes that we have to deal with. We have strong demographic changes. We have intensifying migration tendencies, increase in digitization, and so on. All of this is making our job as landscape architects not a lot easier. That means we're facing the challenge that these man-made system of spaces that J.B. Jackson was talking about are getting extremely complex and extremely dynamic. And we have to find appropriate design and planning strategies to deal with this situation. And I'm always interested to see how the colleagues in the practical world are trying to meet these problems and deal with it. I'm convinced, and I hope you will also be, let's say, together with me on that point, that our aim in landscape architecture is the creation of sustainable living environments. That's why many of you choose to study landscape architecture, to work in that field, because we're trying to establish living environments for people and for nature as well. But the point is, these living environments have to change, they have to be versatile and vital. That means the aim is to secure changeability, versatility, and viability of landscape. Without these characteristics, landscape is losing its identity. That means landscape has to change and to grow, or to put it in a nutshell, we're living in a landscape that must be allowed to change its face without losing its face. And that's for me one of the key sentences that I'm really interested in. How can we change the landscape so it changes its face, but it's not losing its face? And if you see here Paris in the background, this is one of these cities. It changes its face constantly, but it's not losing its face. And you might ask yourself, why is this so? How can we make sure that this happens? And if you look at the big Chinese cities, many of these cities, they change their face and they're losing their face. And you ask yourself, how does that happen? What influence do we have as landscape architects? Here's the hypothesis that I put forward. Again, probably know it. The hypothesis is we are faced with the necessity of evolving structures and forms that can develop in time, which can remain a unity and maintain the coherence of the components at all stages of their growth. The absence of this must lead to self-destruction. I think this is a very, very interesting hypothesis. Unfortunately, it's not from me. Okay. Unfortunately, it was formulated by Willem van Bodegraven in 1952. So here we are with this kind of really interesting hypothesis that was delivered by an architect who was a representative of the so-called structuralists in architecture. And it's interesting, if he talks about structures, as I underlined here, more than 60 years ago, we have to be aware of the fact that he's used the term structure in a very different way than we sometimes use it. And that's very important to understand, because I'm focusing on that term a little bit more, because I think this hypothesis is so important. The necessity of evolving structures and forms that can develop in time, which can remain in unity and maintain the coherence of the components at all stages of the growth. Otherwise, we're going to self-destruction. Now, Willem van Bodegraven is using the term structure not, for example, like Giovanni Battista Piranesi did that. Piranesi and his companions at the time, they had a different understanding of structure, what that was all about. They were talking about construction. Construction has also some kind of implication related to structure, but in the 17th and the 18th century, structure was all about construction. It was like a rigid framework. Van Bodegraven is talking about a different aspect, and I'd like to point that out, but I think you have to understand that. The structuralists used this term structure in a way that was influenced by the development in architecture and urban planning during functionalism. The structuralists, like Willem van Bodegraven and his teammates, so to say, had a certain situation at their time that they were fighting against. They were actually fighting against the so-called functionalism in architecture. Functionalism, I love this movie by Jacques Tati, as many of his interesting movies. Playtime is very interesting because it sort of shows you a world where functionalism is presented at its best. Functionalism always demanded specific places for specific purposes, right? Planners began to divide the man-made system of spaces according to the question, what function do these spaces have and how can they optimize their function? They were dividing the living organism into little lifeless specialisms in order to get rid of the urban chaos, and what they created is something that had to be able to perform at its best. It was about serving rational purposes, and that means these spaces were rather unable to change and to adapt to new conditions. Functionalism. And you know that here Jacques Tati is sort of suffering from this functionalistic world. It's very fascinating. It's a lot of fun, but if you want to know what the bizarre outcomes of functionalism may be, as I said, watch this movie back from 1967. The result of this approach, of this functionalistic approach, was a catastrophe. We know all about that from history, from urban planning. Just remember the Athens Charter from 1933, which called for the partitioning of the modern city into compartments serving according key functions like housing, work, traffic, and recreation. Functionalism did not take a holistic approach, as a matter of fact, but it was trying to optimize the performance of the city. But the city, and that's the problem, is not a machine. The city is not a machine that you can optimize to the max. That's absolutely ridiculous. Man, we are all not rational, purely rational calculated factors. We can't be, put down to little measures and appointments and something like that. We're not being simply calculated, and nature is not a machine that can simply be calculated and manipulated. So I wonder, why do we still do that? Why do we still try to manipulate, to calculate, to get it under control? And if I look at this kind of project here, and I know many of my colleagues are very frustrated when I'm saying this, and I think this ecosystem services approach that we see here, where we talk about the benefits, about the price of nature, this is exactly what we're doing right now. Today we are focusing on the optimization of ecosystems. We're talking about ecosystem services. When we use this approach, it's all about the price of nature, as it says here in this cover. And you have, very interesting here, you can calculate each and every single compartment in our world. And it's the hope that the experts have. And I can understand this. I do understand this idea behind that. But the hope is of the experts that if we put a price tag to each and every single part of our environment, of our living environment, we can then better calculate and defend the value of nature. That's the idea. I understand this, no question. But is this really an approach we can take? Talking about the functional aspects of nature, giving a price tag, which is really difficult. A friend of mine asked me, a very renowned ecologist, said, how much would you like to pay for a bird singing in the morning? €2.50? €3.80? But ecosystem services are trying to make exactly this, and this is a little bit bizarre from my point of view. But, as I said, experts hope that if they put the functionality of nature in the center of attention, it will be easier to defend the value of nature in political circumstances and in administrative circumstances. I understand that. I had once the German Association of Landscape Architects, and the colleagues were really frustrated when I told them, look, what are you doing here? And they said, well, you should sit in these meetings, how difficult it is to defend the green and so on. I said, wait a minute, we all studied landscape architecture and everybody knew that it's not going to be easy. Now, go back and say, let's make the economics work, and that's the way to defend environment. I don't know, it's a bit tricky. I commented on green infrastructure a while ago in the Landezine magazine online, maybe you've seen that. And I was writing there, more and more experts worldwide recommend GI, which is green infrastructure, as the best remedy for all kinds of unwelcome side effects related to current changes in the environment, such as climate change, agricultural revolution, urban transformation, and so on. First of all, I think we have to be aware of the fact that the term green infrastructure might sound very new, but the concept behind this is not new at all. The American environmental and urban planners, Mark Benedict and Edward McMahon, they said in 2002, whereas green space is often viewed as something that is nice to have, and all of you know exactly what we're talking about, that's nice to have, the term green infrastructure implies something that we must have. Protecting and restoring our nation's natural life support system is a necessity, not an amenity. Green infrastructure is a new term, they said, but it's not a new idea. And it's very interesting, if you read the book by these two experts, they find out that the one who invented green infrastructure, as a matter of fact, is no one else but Frederick Law Olmsted. Frederick Law Olmsted, you know him from the designer of the Central Park in New York. Well, actually, he, in 1903, wanted to promote a connection of system of parks and parkways, and he says it's manifestly far more complete and useful than a series of isolated parks. So the idea of connecting green spaces is something very old, and each one of you who studied landscape architecture, landscape ecology knows about that. So the concept behind green infrastructure is absolutely not new, but we've put it in a different wording now for, from my point of view, purely political reasons. Landscape architecture, and that's a bit of pity, I have to admit that, and it's also kind of a self-criticism in a certain way. Within the last 100 years, we obviously did not succeed in anchoring this idea firmly into the public, in the political and the media system. It's such a natural thing, but we sort of didn't succeed in getting it out there. So we're getting our rescue now from a term called green infrastructure that supposedly should help. Look at the EU, for example. It wants to enhance the European natural capital, and this is one of the statements by the European Commission, and it says here, and I quote, "GI is a successfully tested tool for providing ecological, economical and social benefits through natural solutions. It helps us to understand the value of the benefits that nature provides to human society and to mobilize investment to sustain and enhance them. It also helps avoid relying on infrastructure that is expensive to build when nature can provide a cheaper, more durable solutions. It's a strategically planned network of natural and semi-natural areas with other environmental features designed and managed to deliver a wide range of ecosystem services." And here you have it. It's officially put, it's about sustainability in terms of economics. It's a cheaper, a more durable solution, and it delivers wide range of ecosystem services. So there's a deep functionalistic background in this kind of definition that I'm really a little bit skeptical about. Can we really avoid, are you sure we can avoid that the essential qualities of our environment will be sacrificed for the primacy of economy? Here's this green infrastructure, just one example. It's the technical approach, it's the functional approach, which is not totally unnecessary, but to focus on it, merely focus on it, that's for me the bit of a critical part. And do you think we can really avoid, as I said, that good qualities will be not sacrificed for economic reasons? Just because these qualities are not financially measurable, do you think we won't lose them? I'm afraid that the step backwards towards a merely functionalistic planning approach is very short. And we've been there already. The ones who studied, back in the 70s, 80s, and 90s know exactly what I'm talking about. There was no discussion about aesthetical values. It was all about functional values. And I think we run a great risk to get back into the situation. That's going to be difficult for our environment. So, are you sure we're not going to make it economically risky, what we're doing here? That's the question. Another problematic aspect of the term green infrastructure is to focus on the predicate green. A focus on the predicate green in spite of the long established understanding that nature in the city is not only green but also gray. So why do we focus on this green color once more? The color-neutral understanding that nature is not only green but also gray was established and promoted by my friend and Swiss landscape architect Dieter Kienast in the 1990s already. What did that mean? He said, our work is a search for the nature of the city whose color is green, is gray and not just green. Nature in the city means a tree means hedge, grass, but also permeable surface, spacious square, austere canal, high wall, access left open for sight and fresh air, the center and the outskirts. But the most important point is that our work is a search for the nature of the city whose color is gray and not just green. What did he do with this kind of quote? He, as far as I could tell in our own, let's say, context, he liberated us from a fixation on a very traditional understanding of what landscape and nature is all about. He freed us from a stereotype understanding that landscape and landscape architecture has always to do with something that's green. He offered us a new freedom to cooperate with neighboring disciplines such as architecture and urban planners. And landscape architects were esteemed as competent planning partners in recent years precisely because they refused to play the role of the advocates of the green. I remember when I was still learning landscape architect and everybody says, well, you're a landscape architect, okay, everything that's green is your part, everything else, you don't have to deal with that. Now, when someone like Dieter Kienast, they came in and said, the nature of the city is not just green, but it's also gray, this changed the game completely. And we were really respected as partners. And apart from that, it's impossible, by the way, to secure the so-called natural life support system of the city with green alone, that's for sure. And everybody who has a little bit of knowledge about landscape ecology should know that a living system is not only relating on the green infrastructure, the gray, the brown, the blue, or any other color. We have to take into consideration all of them. That's the challenge we have to face. But on the other hand, green infrastructure also carries, from my point of view, a very true and important message. And I think it's right to underline the necessity that we deal with landscape in a structuralistic approach. That's something that I keep also teaching to my students every once in a while, and some of the students are here, and I have to apologize for telling you once again, but that's one of the things that I really believe in. The structuralistic approach to landscape offers us really a very important and powerful tool, and we should take it a little bit more seriously. Landscape is no longer perceived as a total work of art that has to be preserved in an ideal state. I think that's pretty clear by now. So let me get back to Willem van Bodegrafen's hypothesis. We're faced with the necessity of evolving structures that develop and form over time, and so on. The structuralist architects, and let's get back to the architects once more and see what they proposed. In the 60s, they defined structure completely different. That's what I was trying to tell you in the beginning. Here comes the definition of structure by the structuralists. They said a structure is a complete set of relationships in which the elements can change, but in such a way that these remain independent on the whole and retain their meaning. The whole is independent of its relationship to the elements. The relationships between the elements are more important than the elements themselves. That's probably the most important term here. The relationship is more important than the elements themselves. The elements are interchangeable, but not the relationships. So structure in this respect has nothing to do with the rigid, like architectonic framework that cannot change. Structure in this respect is about a changing system, a communication system that establishes the stability but at the same time allows for change and so on. It's quite clear that this definition is strongly related to the concept in linguistics. Maybe you've heard about that already. The structuralistic approach actually came from linguistics. And indeed, we can only understand the structuralistic approach if we accept that we're dealing here with some kind of landscape. So whenever you talk about structure in the structuralistic sense, it's about talking about landscape. Gilles Deleuze pointed out, in fact, landscape is the only thing that can properly be said to have structure. Language is the only thing that can properly be said to have structure. Be it an esoteric or even non-verbal language, there is a structure of the unconscious only to the extent that the unconscious speaks and is a language. There is a structure of bodies only to the extent that bodies are supposed to speak with a language, which is the one of the symptoms. Even things possess a structure only insofar as they maintain a silent discourse, which is the language of science. So structure in this respect has to do with language, okay? And as a matter of fact, I'm pretty sure that landscape architecture is such a non-verbal language. We are communicating, we're putting things together, we're giving them a dialogue, we're putting them in context. It's a non-verbal language, and as such, landscape and landscape architecture naturally has structure, but not the structure in the rigid sense, but in the structuralistic sense. That's what I'd like to point out. Now, if we look at the buildings of the structuralists, and this is the reason why architects don't like to talk about structuralism anymore. If we look at the buildings of the structuralist architects built in the 1960s and 70s, you might have your doubts, and I have them too. Did these buildings really meet the criteria mentioned in the definition that we heard before? Structures made of concrete, glass, or brick are inevitably limited in their dynamics, in their flexibility, changeability, and viability, that's for sure. That's one of the reasons. There are many other reasons why structuralism is not that hip in architecture anymore, but this is one of the reasons. There is not that part. The other point, by the way, is someone who gives all his energy to building a structure and not to the object is giving up control, and that's something where architects have sometimes their troubles with, and landscape architects obviously too. So anyway, but if we look at landscape, that same definition of what a structure is all about suddenly makes a lot of sense. Landscape structuralism is different from architectural structuralism simply because we're dealing here with a living superorganism. That means we're not dealing with a static building, we're living with something that is alive, and we cannot avoid it to be alive, we want it to be alive. And this definition by the Swiss architects, as I said, structure is a complete set of relationships, is a perfect definition of what landscape is all about. Landscape is a set of relationships. Things are in relation with each other. And the components can change within this framework. It's flexible, but the relationships is what stabilizes this whole network. So it describes very well our current understanding of landscape as a living network of relationships, and they are relevant not only in terms of economy, but also in terms of ecology, but most important, in terms of sociology. Landscape is something that is creating networks and relationships between people. It's the social aspect that is so important for what landscape is all about. Decades ago, the structuralists in architecture pointed out that there are certain rules to be respected in order to protect the vitality of living networks. And I'm convinced that it's about high time to look at these rules again from the 1950s and 60s. I know that's not new, but why not look at the old stuff and see if it works better right now, better than the concepts that have been presented to us that I just pointed out. It's, I think, necessary to carefully revisit these principles and incorporate them into an enlarged concept of landscape structuralism. I'm very convinced about that, especially because we're running currently at high risk of getting caught up again in the dangerous belief in functionalistic mechanisms, and that's the point that I'd like to underline. There are 6 recommendations by the structuralists that I find particularly interesting for landscape architects, and maybe you can also use these 6 criteria that I'm going through right now to explain you a little bit. Maybe you use that as a kind of a checklist. Look at the landscape architecture projects that are built today and then go through this checklist just for the fun of it. I'm not saying that each and every project has to meet these criteria, I don't try to put everything under some kind of rule, but look at the projects today and see, do they meet these requirements in terms of structuring our society? Here are these 6 criteria. Number 1, the structuralist said, respect the fundamental principles of human existence and the power of archetypes. Interesting. The fundamental principles of human existence and the power of archetypes. The structuralist said, man has, during its development, created some basic structures, some archetypes that are important for our living together. The structuralist said, man did develop technical means during history, but the basic beliefs and the basic ideas and the basic structures are still the same, and we're just reinterpreting them in a certain way. So if you look at something like that, it still works in the same kind of quality. It is an archetype. It is really getting people to understand and to read intuitively what's going on. And this is one of the principles that the structuralists are pointing out. The second point is avoid pure functionalistic, sectoral and strongly formal orientation in planning and design. I'd like to point out that they talk about pure functionalistic. So the structuralists did not say no functions at all, but a pure functionalistic approach would be, from their point of view, from the structuralistic point of view, rather difficult. And the third point is accept the existing and the isochronical. That means consider historical and contemporary structures as equally valuable. From the structuralist point of view, they said it's rather unnecessary to differentiate between good historical components and bad contemporary components, but for the relationship, both components have their right and they should be looked at equally and not differentiate between them. As a matter of fact, this famous part Duisburg Nord by Peter Lutz is just about that. It's layers of different times that are respected and structurally integrated into the contemporary urban fabric. That means we're not looking at, oh, that's the good old stuff and the bad new stuff. No, it's combined, and the structure of the landscape is evolved in looking at both of these elements isochronically, so we don't differentiate between good and bad, between valuable or worthless elements, but the criteria is it structures our urban life and our living together. This is just to show how the old elements and the new elements are overlaid, and a landscape structure is being built up. The fourth point is promote and reinforce the changeability, viability, and versatility of structural networks. So that's something you all know about. Landscapes have to change, they have to live, otherwise they will not survive. So each and every project we're realizing today, we should take an eye on the fact or on the question, do we really promote change? Do we really promote the viability and versatility? Do we add it to a structural network? And the fifth point is create polyvalent spaces in order to allow the free adoption of structures. That's momentarily, from my point of view, quite a very interesting and important question here. Polyvalent spaces, poly means many and valent means value. The spaces should have more than just one value. It should have many values. Especially now that we have in Europe right now people coming in from foreign countries. And quite frankly, from a German point of view, I'm very happy that we have so many foreign people come into our country, because it begins for us to give us the chance to culturally grow, to get more flexible, to understand finally that we're not living in an isolated situation on an island, but we're in a network across the country. I'm very happy about that. But that means we have, as landscape architects, we have to make sure that these people also understand and get an idea that the places that we design could have a value for them, polyvalent, more than just one value, in cultural or religious or whatever respect. So places like this is not green. It's an interesting project. It should be researched quite a bit more. That was a green space before, and now it's a gray space. And everybody said this is not going to work out. It's one of the most successful spaces you have in Zurich right now, because it's so open, it's flexible, it's viable, and not because it's green, but it is gray and still it talks about nature. It would be an own lecture on that, but I don't want to do that right now. But this is a space that has so many different values. As a matter of fact, this space in Zurich is so successful that the city of Zurich now had to give out regulations how many days this space can be used for specific purposes, because the people in Zurich, the inhabitants of Zurich, said, hey, this is our plaza, we want to use it every day, but there is so many things happening that they had to put regulations on it. It's just to prove that this really works. And that place looks like this. It takes on a very special, different value during winter time, but that's just one of many, many examples. And the last point is, the sixth point is, emphasize communication as the structuring factor. It's communication that makes our places, it's communication that makes our open spaces so valuable. The communication, not only like verbal communication, but also the exchange of information, of energy, and so on. So communication is really a multi-level construction here. And these aspects, and as I said, maybe you take these 6 checkpoints and just see how do projects relate to these points and see what happens. It would be an interesting situation. So if you look at projects like this one here, very old project from Berlin, from TS Landscape Architects. Of course it's an archetype. It is this big kind of land art intervention. Of course it is very simple, but it's about communication. It's a communicating space, and people begin to communicate with each other, and that's what makes it more valuable. I know that experts are complaining about, the maintenance is so difficult, and the angles are too steep, and whatever, all these technical things that it has, but it is a place that establishes part of the network in a city, or establishes the network of the city as a landscape. And also this one here, the Highline project, is about communication. It's connecting in many different ways, many different activities. It's not so much about, how nicely the details are and what the lighting is, all that's very important. Okay, but for the city as a landscape, the communication in these areas is the most important aspect. Let's get to the end of this lecture, of this introduction, and I hope it will spark off maybe also some discussion later on. This is, and I've shown it before, the first detailed map of an animal's neural network. It has never been established before. How our neurons in the brain are connected. This is the most detailed rendering of interconnections in a mammal brain that has ever been produced yet. It's the, as I said, Alan Mau's Brain Connectivity Atlas that you see here. And you can see it traces all the connections between the tiny voxels of brain tissue containing between 100 and 500 different neurons, but that's just the beginning. It's just the beginning of a mapping of a brain, more or less. And I would like to point out that it's very risky, obviously, if you look at such a construction here, and this is also kind of a landscape from my point of view, and it's obvious that it's very risky to dissect this complex interconnected system and divide it up into blue, yellow, green, brown, red, and I don't know what modules. It's the connection that's more important, rather than the division. Landscape is not an infrastructure from my point of view that can be planned in sectors, absolutely not. But it's a compound of natural and artificial features. It's infrastructures and suprastructures. It's not just infra, but also supra, closely interwoven to a living whole. As landscape architects, we naturally do have the responsibility, whether we want it or not, to develop this living organism, this superorganism, in a most intelligent way, I hope. And to me, landscape structuralism is the right strategy from my point of view to create, establish, and stabilize urban landscape systems, and it opens for us communication possibilities to all other disciplines out there that are responsible for the design of a living organism, of a landscape called the city. Thank you very much.